Hey folks, I'm here today with Karl Faase. It's great to be with Karl. Karl is the CEO of Olive Tree Media. Has 20 years experience in the media industry and radio and TV. Welcome, Karl. Great to have you with us.
John, it's great to join you and everybody else with us today.
Karl, your organization, Olive Tree Media, produces a number of series, especially for small group and online viewing and discussion, and prompting people to really think a bit more deeply about their faith and their journey with Jesus. And your latest series, Encounter, people Jesus met then and now. It's fascinating me. 10-episode series. We'll put a link for it in the description down below. But what prompted the creation of this particular series? You've got a whole bundle of them on your website, I know, which I will link to. Yeah. But what prompted the creation of this particular series?
Well, we've just done a couple of series, Jesus the Game Changer. We did a couple of versions of that. We did Faith Runs Deep. That was partly because we couldn't leave our lounge rooms, let alone the country. And for those who don't know, something like Jesus the Game Changer, season 1 and 2, they were filmed across the globe. Faith Runs Deep is an Australian series. And then we were looking at, the next iteration of what we could do to serve the church and be a gospel resource for churches across Australia. So we actually did something that sounds totally pretentious, John, but we did this little world tour and we met as many key leaders as we could. So we were in London and met a bunch of people around the UK. We went across to Wheaton in the US, LA in the US, and then met people in Sydney and Melbourne. And what we were asking was, so what's happening now? If you were to look across the Western globe, like the Western countries, modern liberal Western democracies, what's happening now in the area of gospel and evangelism? What does a church need? Because the last thing we wanted, John, was to go out and film a fabulous series that was great for 5 years ago. And so we were trying to say, what's going on now? And it was out of those conversations that the concept and the series Encounter came. And to preempt your next question, the key ideas behind Encounter is the idea of, and I know you've spoken about this yourself recently, the concept of Justin Brierley, who's one of the people that we interviewed, which is the surprising rebirth and belief in God. And that kind of was echoed across a number of our conversations. So sometimes, like back in 2014, we produced a series called Towards Belief, and it was diffusing the belief blockers of our time, the whole apologetics thing. And then what we realized today is that we don't actually need, in a way, more apologetics. We need to be able to just speak into a generation and a cohort of people who are just exploring faith and exploring the concept of faith and what does faith look like. And so interestingly, in Encounter, we introduced Jesus. We introduced encounters that Jesus had. Then we also introduced people who are having similar encounters today. But nowhere do we try and explain it or kind of say, oh, well, here's an apologetic behind that concept. It's a bit like saying, we know that you're looking for this, so let us give it to you. So that's what Encounters are.
It's a bit like the Gospels, isn't it? The Gospel stories are just presented as stories. There's no kind of, and the moral of this story is, at the end of the story, it's kind of like, hey, here's the story. Have a look at this story. See what it does in you and for you, and see how Jesus interacts with people. I love this series. I think this is a fabulous and just timely, so spot on timely. But you traveled around the globe talking to a bundle of people. Who was the most interesting, intriguing, sort of different character that you talked to? Who kind of made you think more deeper, maybe, and more intently about even the series?
And someone who's, given that we did interviews in places like Africa and different parts of the world, one that would seem slightly boring but was actually incredibly interesting, who is a guy that's been on my Facebook feed, whose name's come up a few times in some discussions, and his name's Paul Kingsnorth. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, John. Most people listening to us won't have heard of Paul Kingsnorth. And the reason is his background was he went to Oxford University. Dad was kind of atheistic, almost in the Richard Dawkins mold. He went followed that. Was an environmentalist, not a radical environmentalist, and that was his passion, his heart. And he was just following down that track. And then in his mid-30s to late 30s, he had this desire to look into spirituality more deeply. And he said, we interviewed him in Western Ireland, which was just a long way, but a cracking place to go. And he said, of course, I come from the West, so the first place to look is the East. So for his 40th birthday, and he's quite serious about this, for his 40th birthday, he did a 4-day silent Buddhist retreat. And he kind of pursued Buddhism quite significantly and seriously. Then you know why he stepped away from Buddhism, John? Because it doesn't believe in a God.
Oh, wow.
Which is an interesting concept. I'd never really thought of this before.
Yeah,
Buddhism doesn't actually believe in God. It actually believes in a framework for living, and we actually had another of our guests, the now Archbishop of the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, who you will know was actually in Perth for a period of time. He grew up a Buddhist. So he actually talks about Buddhism as well. So Paul it gets a bit tired of that, just isn't working. So he explores somewhere else and he goes to Wicca. And because it's, that connection with the environment, and he was in a local coven and the whole deal, and then he just realized that it was not right. And then he says this, John, he says this, and I had this terrible thought. I might have to become Christian. And the interesting thing is he has all these reflections about being English and the Church of England and the place of the Church of England in the UK. And it's a bit like, there are people in the UK who are as concerned that the Church of England would disappear as they are that it would be taken seriously. Wow. And he said, when I followed Buddhism, nobody cared. When I followed Wicca, it was a bit like, knock yourself out. When I became a Christian, they were like, really? We need to perform an intervention. He has really lost it. Now, that all of that is so interesting when you think about the world in which we live in the West. And he's written a lot. He's a very good writer, has a wonderful story. So, Paul Kingsnorth is perhaps one of my favorites.
That's fascinating. It's interesting at the moment, as we're recording this, the start of 2025, there is this kind of rising curiosity, dare I say, revival. I don't know if I should use that word, but, the Wes Huff, Joe Rogan interview that's gone hugely, millions of people watching it, the whole Wes Huff thing. Wes is now appearing on my YouTube feed like nobody else. Watched a bit of him. But there is this whole thinking, Tom Holland, the Dominion Rest is History podcast guy. There's this whole thinking and movement. Richard Dawkins even saying, well, maybe cultural Christianity isn't a bad thing. Maybe we should, it's the atheist guy talking about cultural Christianity is a good thing. Yep. It's interesting to me. How do you think the Encounter series connects with this really current vibe that's going on around the world?
Well, if you do read Justin Briley's book, The Surprising Rebirth and Belief in God, Paul Kingsnorth is in that book. Another guy called Martin Shaw, who we introduced, and he's in the book. There's a lady whose name's Heather. Oh gosh, I've just forgotten her second name. And she was a writer for the Guardian magazine, and just your bog standard progressive leftist journalist who's come to faith. So we tell the stories of the people who are reflecting that shift within the world. And I think one of the things that Justin Briley touches on in the book, which I think is very accurate, is the number of thinkers and writers that are in this space. Now, it's the Martin Shaws and the Paul Kingsnorths, and we actually interviewed Tom Holland. So if you watch Jesus the Game Changer 2, Tom Holland's on that. We got him before everybody else did, John. But there's also the Douglas Murrays. There's the story of Ion Hershey Ali and her husband Niall Ferguson. Right. One of the better historians and writers in the world. What we do with Russell Brand being baptized is another thing altogether.
Yes.
And so just in case people think that's just the elite, probably in England, think about the fact that research in Australia done by the NCLS research released last year. And when they asked young men in Australia and young women aged between 17 and 25, I think it was, how important is spirituality in your life? Those answering spirituality is very important in our life. Something like 28% of men said yes, and only 17% of women. So you actually have, and then the other thing that's happening globally, and this is impact, I think people like Jordan Peterson is impacting this a lot, and even and the whole Joe Rogan thing is impacting this a lot as well. And even Rogan is saying some interesting things at the moment about, and none of the, I just think a lot of these guys are not Christians. That's not the point. What they're saying is, if you go back to Christopher Hitchens, you know, God is not good, how religion poisons everything. We've gone from that to, we have to reinvest in Christianity because I think this is the future for us. So in that whole process, you've got this shift. And one of the things that's happening between young men and young women, if you look at some of the other research globally, is that young men are becoming more conservative and young women are either staying or becoming more progressive in not their theology, but in their politics. And but that politics for young men is actually quite often wedded to concepts of spirituality, belief, and if I can use the word theology. So where Encounter, this is what I said earlier, where Encounter sits is it basically tries to go, you're thinking about this, here's a whole bunch of people who have encountered Jesus, and they've encountered Jesus in crazy, radical ways. Now, John, I know that you have a Pentecostal background and I'm a Baptist. So what we're looking for in people finding Jesus has probably been slightly different. And I want you to know that we have both. In fact, episode 1, if people go to our website, episode 1 is there free to watch. And without typecasting people, if you're sort of slightly more conservative on the Anglican end, episode 1 will actually worry you a little because there are 2 people that have the most remarkable experiences. And they're following Jesus. Later on in the series, we get people like Kanishka Raphael, the Archbishop, who's reading his Bible, like Heather, I just talked about, went to church. A guy called Alonzo Paul, who ends up going to church. And if I can just say this, John, that the Alonzo Paul thing was, he had this right into drugs, heroin addiction, all that stuff, opioids, I guess I should say, rather than heroin. Has this terrible experience. His sister invites him to church. He goes to church, and he said, I'm sitting there listening to the pastor. And then, and like every week, he's like, dude, you're talking to me. Like, have you got somebody out there watching me? I mean, once it's okay, but every week, really? And we all know what that is. It's the spirit of God, speaking through his word and speaking through people. Yeah. So we have those stories as well. So it's a total mix.
Good range. And I think the series is so timely, and I think for so many churches it'd be brilliant, especially for the young adults, but also I can say for my generation of older saints who will enjoy the fact of seeing that there is this move, this revival, curiosity, whatever it is. There's definitely a move going on in the Bible.
And what we do in each episode is to actually introduce an encounter that Jesus has. And then we have Lynn Cohick in Houston, Texas, a very, very able New Testament scholar, and Michael Bird, who a lot of people would know, who's from Melbourne. Right. And they both kind of comment on Jesus, what have an interaction with Jesus. Say Jesus meets Levi, and he's a tax collector. So what was the big deal about tax collectors? Why would they be seen as kind of sinners, like prostitutes, And I should let you a little kind of secret to everybody that's listening to us. We were planning originally to film all those pieces in Israel.
Which
is a great idea till the 7th of October.
Great idea until that date.
It was a bit like, is there another way we can do this? So, but that works really well because they introduce that kind of background of who Jesus was.
Brilliant.
And then basically what we're trying to do is to say, you know what? People are still encountering Jesus in pretty much exactly the same way.
So you met so many fascinating people. As we come towards a conclusion, what was the most significant takeaway for you personally through all these conversations, Karl, which would have been intriguing and fascinating?
Yeah, look, absolutely marvelous. From a homeless guy in Nairobi, Kenya, who was a kind of a head of the gangs in his area of Nairobi, Kenya, ends up in church and finds the love of Jesus, now planting a church in Nairobi, Kenya, through to, as I said, Paul Kingsnorth, who's an Oxford graduate, through to Kanishka Raphael, who's the Archbishop of the Sydney Diocese and grew up as a Buddhist. I think what it reminded me of a truth that we both know, that Jesus still encounters people today.
Awesome.
And we, you know, you and I both run churches, and we've been to more seminars than we know what to do with, and we've written strategy papers and all this stuff. And I'm not decrying any of that. I think that's all that really is really important. In the end, Jesus breaks through his Spirit. And in the end, the Spirit still works. And in the end, all these different ways of finding Jesus are still real and still valid. And even though we read the Bible and something miraculous happens, like the angel appearing to Mary and saying that she's going to be pregnant without, like, that's kind of crazy. And yet when we see that happen today, there's the conservatives. I'm kind of one of those that kind of go, oh, that's a bit of a worry. It's a bit like, really? God still, and I think it was just that, John, and awesome. Because all of the different situations where we met people, that's just a remarkable story, and great to tell, and wonderfully encouraging.
That's so good. Jesus is still at work today. So a church grabs the encounter series. Give them one really good tip on how to leverage it well within their church, either through a small group or Sundays or whatever. Give a pastor who are watching, listening now, one really good tip on how to leverage encounter.
Well, this is a tip, but it's going to sound like a pitch, so I apologize.
A pitch and a tip can work together beautifully.
I ran a church for 20 years, John. So and as you ran one, you're involved for 30 years. I kind of realized what pastors want. They want high quality. They want it. They want to be able to use it really simply without having to go through a 10-week course.
Yep.
And we're all cheap and nasty, so we don't want to be expensive. And the whole not expensive and high quality don't tend to go together well. Well, that's what we have. Yeah, we've set this up. So if your small group wants to use it, you can go onto our Watch Plus platform. So olivetreemedia.com.au, Watch Plus platform, and you can sign up, and a small group can do Encounter. But you can actually sign up as a small or large church, and you can do it across your church. So on our website is the notes for 10 sermons, if you want to do that, an outline for your kids' ministry for 10 weeks, a whole full 10-week kids' ministry, study guide for all of your small groups, collateral in that we got like short clips that you can play on a Sunday if you're preaching on it, and so everything that you need is there for you. So if you're looking at this year, and those, as both of us know, when 52 weeks Sundays stretch out in front of you, they can look a little endless. But here's the way, you know what, in second term, third term, as a number of churches are doing in Australia right now, a large church in Brisbane, I'm going to be speaking at next week, a church that's a middle-sized church in Perth, I'll be speaking at in a few weeks' time, and they're doing it between 6 and 10 weeks. And that way, you've got all the notes you need, your children's program, your small groups, everybody's on the same page, and you're watching outstanding material that relates to the issues of today. So I think that's the best way of using it, but you can use it as a small group resource. You can use it as a gospel resource as well. But one last thing to say, John, is you don't have to do the whole thing. It's like all of our series are designed the same way. Every episode stands on its own. So if you just did one, it would work. If you did all 10, they would work. They don't kind of build on each other. You don't have to watch all of them for it to work. So you just choose the number, get on and get this to be just a fabulous resource to impact your community for Jesus.
Karl, we'll put a link in the description below and compile on into Encounter. Thanks so much for joining us today. Grab a hold of Encounter. I know it's going to help you.
Thanks, John.